Okay, John, why don't you start by introduce to us who you are and what you
All
do?
right. Thank you very much. And I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to this group. And I
Uh,
appreciate Jane organizing this. I am speaking to you from my farm in northern New Hampshire in the US. We're
oh,
still in quarantine. And I remember very fondly my visits to China with Jane and the travel and to the various cities and seeing the blockchain university and all the activities there. There was
well,
a very fond memories and very informative for me. And I very much appreciate the translation of the book in Chinese and to celebrate that. Could we go to the next slide too then? The little background on myself. I am currently a research scientist at the MIT Media Lab. I have been there 12 years. I've worked in the human dynamics group and also the city science group, and working on developing models of cities, new ways of financing tokenization. My background is a artificial intelligence. I did my PhD in that. I've started 6 different companies, and before MIT, I was 12 years at Harvard, the Harvard Law School, where I founded the Law Lab. And much of my career has been involved around how do you build decentralized organizations, very much involved in complexity science and applying that to legal and governance frameworks and new kinds of economics. So here's the agenda. What I'd like to talk about is a little background and context for the book, From Bitcoin to Burning Man and Beyond. And that was written in 2014. And that was a group organization of a nonprofit called ID Cubed. And I'd like to go back and look at some of the ideas and insights that we had at the time and that we organized that and published the book. And then I'd like to do is say what's happening now, what we've learned from Bitcoin and Burning Man, what's happened in the last 5 or 6 years, and where we see things going, and the kind of activities and projects that we're currently involved in, and what kinds of implications it'll have in the real world. I think we're seeing that what was once ideas now are being put into practice. And then I will describe some of the things that we're doing in various projects at MIT and elsewhere, and then we'll have questions. So the inspiration for the title and part of the thinking behind the book From Bitcoin to Burning Man came from the Burning Man Festival. It's an art festival every year in the desert where 70,000 people come together and they form a community based upon art and gift exchange. So what you see on your right is a big statue, not a statue, but an artifice of Burning Man. It's a structure that they build and then they burn after the 2 weeks, and then they clean everything up. So there's nothing standing.
如果大
And the
家
whole attempt
OK
is
so
to invent new kinds of community.
OK go ahead.
Next slide.
Oh, next one. OK.
Yes.
OK.
So Burning Man has roughly 70,000 people that come each year, and many of them come from the tech community in Silicon Valley. And many are the heads of different. Oops, this slide before, please. We got one ahead. You just go back. Yes, thanks. And they have 10 rules for how to create autonomy and self-organization in the community. The next slide.
The next slide. Oh, OK.
Yeah, yes, this one. Yes, thank you. And these are principles that are pretty interesting and that inform how we think of next generation decentralized societies. Yeah, and so the first concept is what they call radical inclusion. and that means that you can include everybody. It's not exclusive. The second one is gifting. In other words, people give things to one another. Nothing is done for money. Third is decommodification, which means it's all about art, not commodities. The fourth one is radical self-reliance. Everyone who comes there has to bring their own water, their own food, their own shelter. It's in the desert, so it gets very hot during the day and very cold at night, and you have storms. So people are expected to take care of themselves. And radical self-expression. If you look up Burning Man, you'll see people wearing very exotic clothes. They have art cars. They have various kinds of public art. It's very expressive, very inventive, and everything is done for free. So it's a communal effort. And that's number 6. Civic responsibility. That notion is that you have responsibility to the community and to one another. There's no government. This is all voluntary, should be said, and people are all doing this on their own. And leaving no trace means that you do not leave any waste. You clean up, and it looks pristine, perfect, just as the time when you first came. And everyone is expected to participate. And so there's a high degree of participation by everyone in making the community work, expressing, engaging one another. The final one is immediacy, which they say basically there's a sense of living in that moment. So one of the important things to remember about Burning Man is that it's just not in Nevada. It's a festival that's replicated around the world. They're called Burning Without Borders. So it really is part of a more global movement and representing how people want to organize themselves in a new way. And then the next slide. So one of the things that we wanted to look at, and we wrote the book From Bitcoin to Burning Man, and also the articles, and formed a nonprofit called ID Cubed, was to develop a platform that allowed for new kinds of self-organization. And one of the key concepts is how to deal with identity and authority, and move away from more hierarchical static systems that are more traditional, in which you see here a Hindu caste system, the patriarchal lineages, and the medieval chain of being. These were all ways of organizing oneself that was very rigid. Roles were defined. Credentials were very hard to get to do things. It was a system that we've inherited. It even goes into the current industrial revolution. So what we have in the present is it's what we call traditional artifacts of identities and access. In other words, what you're able to do in society, where you're able to go, what benefits you can achieve, have much to do with your kinds of credentials, your passport, where you are in your social registration, your credit scores, your access to medical. Even in the Middle Ages in Europe, they saw indulgence, what they called indulgences to heaven. You had to buy from the church in order to get access to heaven. Okay. So we see that these traditional ways of creating credentials and allocating was very rigid, is not very fair, it's not very flexible, and it is something that was ready for change. So it went in the group, the nonprofit called ID Cube that published the book, is that what we wanted to do was create a platform called Open Mustard Seed that allowed people to create new kinds of digital institutions, get control of the identity, and have a flexible way of providing credentials. And so we could look at the next slide. I think that's on the movie, I believe. No. So what you have is the phone became a very powerful device. The phone is actually, the mobile phone has transformed everything in terms of how we organize our life. It collects data, it organizes data. You can make predictions about where people are going to be, what they're going to buy. It is totally transformative. But the question for lots of people have is the extent to which it is my phone or spy phone. What control do we have over the phone, and how do we get that data and get control of that data so that it's used for the benefit of everyone? This is a video that we did for open mustard seed,
Uh,
explaining what we're building.
I am, but who am I online? Every action I take produces information reflecting my habits, tastes, and ideas, leaving behind a trail of data that uniquely identifies me and my relationships. But I don't always know how my data are used, where they are kept, who controls them. People feel watched, manipulated, distrustful, targeted. A lack of trust also stifles economic activity and growth. We need to have control over our digital identity and personal data. Meet Open Mustard Seed, a free and open platform that gives us genuine control over our own data in a secure, transparent, and accountable way. By simply being ourselves, we naturally generate our own secure digital credentials, eliminating the need for passwords and mind-numbing logins. We can share specific data at the appropriate time and place with only the people we want. By its design, OMS fulfills the promise of both the U.S. government Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights and EU Data Protection Directive about data. OMS will increase trusted relationships based on genuine human connections beyond physical and geographical limits, eliminating the toll takers, fees, and friction between exchanges, reinforcing microeconomies and emerging markets, enabling a sustainable growth, and allowing virtual currencies to be introduced. Only by giving all people control over their own identities and their personal data, we can make the world's new economy prosper freely and fairly. OMS, Open Mustard Seed.
So one of the things that came out of our efforts at Open Mustard Seed and IDQ was something called wind hover principles. And this was something that we had worked with a number of the new kind of cryptocurrency companies and also the Department of Treasury to get some general principles of how to control personal data and move towards a more decentralized and transparent infrastructure. It should be said that when we started IDQ and Open Mustard Seed, it was before Bitcoin and blockchain and Ethereum. So we came up with some of these ideas earlier, but then with the explosion in Bitcoin and the new currency, the cryptocurrencies and Ethereum, these ideas became all the more important. So we came up with this concept of self-sovereign identity and control over personal data, transparent enforcement, and effective light governance. The idea was not to have heavy governance and create accountability in governance, ensuring trust and privacy and open source collaboration. These principles were picked up by a number of banks and a number of companies who didn't embrace them. So, as I said, there were two major innovations in the last decade that changed things. And that, of course, certainly was Bitcoin and Ethereum. And this is something that when we started, had not happened, but that sort of changed the whole conversation and the thoughts about what the infrastructure should be that we go on. So as a result of that, there were thousands of cryptocurrencies that were produced. There's an explosion in innovation. And with that came ICOs. So next slide. So the ICO, the advent of the ICOs was, yes, there was a lot of speculation, there was money made and lost, but it completely transformed the financial services industry and highlighted the inadequacy of the current infrastructure. What was important in the findings of the introduction of the blockchain decentralized ledger technology was this whole question of permission versus permissionless blockchains, a public blockchain versus a private blockchain, the interoperability of blockchain. There was a proliferation of explosion of innovation and with different approaches taken by different parties. So in the US, you had many innovations in consortiums around banks, insurance companies, financial institutions, and supply chains. All the big players were involved in developing blockchain solutions or decentralized distributed ledger technology, and it became mainstream in the United States, in the EU. And China, as you all aware, took a very strategic and coordinated and directed approach and made a major commitment to blockchain. I've visited many cities in China. There's a blockchain university through MIT. I've been in Beijing and Shanghai. All of the major cities seem to have their own blockchain associations, and then there are blockchains, the consortiums around particular companies that reflect a very visionary and active recognition of the power of blockchain. And there are many types of tokens when we think of cryptocurrencies. And when in the U.S. with FINMA regulations, with the organizations of FINMA for financial regulations, and I've worked in the U.S. and Switzerland, setting up my own foundation there. And the notion is of security tokens, utility tokens, and payment tokens. So there's a lot of challenges to traditional regulators as to how to think about tokens. There are other kinds of tokens, what they call non-fungible tokens, that offer new kinds of opportunities in creating credentials on online games. There's commodity tokens, rewards tokens. And then when you look at security tokens, there are many different kinds of security tokens. So this is a huge challenge, not only to regulators within the US and Europe, but China and around the world as well. And the extent to which the regulators understand and be able to embrace this new infrastructure is going to affect the success of different countries in being a leadership role in the future. So what this does is just highlight, this is the fragility of the current international infrastructure. Is sort of what I call they call a Rube Goldberg machine. It's held together. It's by piecemeal. It's very fragile. It was not designed to be digital. This is what's going to have to change in the near future. So what you have is an attempt to change the international exchange of value and monetary system is the invention of Libra through Facebook. And it wants to issue its own, what they call stable coin, that allows you to go in and out of fiat currency into different kinds of tokens. And this is a major effort put together by Zuckerberg. It was not well received, I don't think, in the US, and especially in Europe. And now that Facebook is under lots of scrutiny, is not terribly popular. It's not clear to me that Libra will be successful. So I think what's happening in China with the digital currency electronic payment is very, very promising. And I think is indicative of a Chinese leadership role in this, particularly when you link it to what's happening with Tencent and Alibaba. And there's already within China a receptivity to digital exchange, digital currencies and forms of payment. So we're at a transition point. What was optional now is necessary. And by that, I mean that when we first wrote From Bitcoin to Burning Man, we were looking at this as a source of innovation that was obviously superior to our current systems, but not absolutely necessary or immediate. And now I think things are changing very quickly, where it's widely recognized that we need to introduce new kind of infrastructure and technology, and the whole notion of autonomous decentralization. And with that comes 5G, IoT, machine learning is the future. So we have in 2020 almost biblical changes from our point of view. The four horsemen of the apocalypse. You can go right next slide from that too. Yeah, so as we know, in 2020 now we have we have the pandemic, and we have and that was totally unexpected. And when we were thinking about writing in from Bitcoin to BurningMan and new decentralization, we were not confronted with these international challenges. The pandemic is just a forerunner of waking us up globally to make us recognize how interdependent we are and how we need to develop new ways of organizing ourselves. The other thing that we did not think of when we were writing the book from Bitcoin to BurningMan was the importance and the imminence of climate change. And arguably we have within 10 years in which we have to make dramatic changes, or we're going to make the better part of the planet uninhabitable. Good. So the next slide. Yeah, so what we're looking at is the carbon cap. The ways of dealing with climate change don't work. Next slide.
Okay.
An estimated 1 million species are going to extinct. Next slide. And the whole theory of trickle-down economics is trickle up. And this is particularly true in the United States and Europe, but other parts of the world where there's a failure of market economies. So there is and we're well aware, global inequity of both. There's a sense that the system is not working for everybody. In the United States, this is very recent, and it's very surprising, the whole Black Lives Matter explosion. And it's not just in the United States, they're in Germany and Australia and other countries that have. So there's a general recognition that there's something inequitable about the societies that needs change. This is hard. This shows all the protest in the United States around Black Lives Matter. It's hard to imagine that this is very spontaneous. It's something unlike anything I've ever seen. It's certainly different than it was in 1968. It cuts across white and black. It's different age, but it's continuous. So this is something that's really new and really basic, and there's an appetite for a new kind of infrastructure, a new kind of social economic organization. So there is a challenge, and there is some very strong work that's been done, mathematical models that show free markets are algorithms for inequality. They don't work unless there is some kind of government intervention. This is from an article in the Scientific American. So there's a new way of thinking that free markets are free to extract wealth, but they generate what we call negative externalities and concentrate power. By that we mean that, okay, do you want to, the private sector is free to create wealth, but it leaves the mess, the externalities to the masses and to the environment. So it creates value, but there are also these negative externalities that the public sector is supposed to pick up, but is not able to. And the basic example of this is environment and climate change. In other words, we're creating a problem that's too big for any public sector to deal with by itself. And the fact is that public interests get captured by private interests. Okay, this slide talks about the winners and losers from the transition in energy infrastructure. And by that, I mean the transition from going from fossil fuel into sustainable energy, principally. And this is an inevitable change. It's accelerating right now. The cost of solar is per kilowatt is less than coal. We're making the transition. And what it shows is the effect on GDP for different governments. And you'll see that it has a highly negative effect for the US. and a very positive effect for China. And so what we're seeing, I think, in the transition in the world infrastructure is a transition from a currency and economies that are based on a fossil fuel into those that are more sustainable, will be driven by that, and also more digital. The two go together. So that's what that slide says. Well, what's happening now, there's something called ESG metrics and funds to the rescue. And what ESG metrics and funds are ways of measuring environmental impact, the carbon impact, the pollution impact, and how to reduce those and how to direct investments to reduce these negative outcomes. So there's called environmental impact, societal impact. It's around social equity and what they call the Gini index, which is a measure of inequality, effective governance. And so this is a new kind of measurement of fund performance that is targeted to directing investments out of the fossil economy, out of this inequitable economy, into a new kind of economy. And it has been embraced by the major investment groups, including Goldman Sachs, including BlackRock, and KKR, a number of very big private investment groups. There's up to $22 trillion. Unfortunately, right now, it's still a bit of greenwashing. It needs better independent metrics. So global growth and sustainable developments, trillions of dollars. This is 2018. There's $30 trillion. Is example of showing the transition of investments. So what we show is that, and this is happening even faster into the 2020, is that there are more and more funds going into ESG funds, and that they are oversubscribed. So the UN has Sustainable Development Goals. It represents an effort to have measurable goals to direct investment. In addition, Japan has a notion of a Society 5.0. It is, in my mind, it's a better idea than sort of the World Economic Forum and sort of the industrialization. It is the fourth industrial economy. What they say here is very interesting. It contrasts sort of Society 4.0 to Society 5.0. And it represents a very strong difference in thinking, in a sense it emphasizes diversity, decentralization, resilience, which we'll talk about, sustainability. And so part of the Japanese thinking is to develop the infrastructure around this. I know that China is thinking similarly, but this reflects national policies and directed policies around creating this new kind of this decentralized order. So at MIT, what we're doing at the City Science Group is developing models of different communities in which we measure different kinds of outcomes around notions of diversity, density, proximity, and energy consumption. And the goal is to benchmark communities, cities, parts of cities, and then see what kind of interventions can drive them to the point of where they start to reduce the carbon count, the energy consumption, and the inequities. So we're getting to the point where now we're starting to measure, put sensors in cities to capture this data in such a way that can drive ESG investments into communities and into cities. We have developed these models in many cities in China, the US, and elsewhere. The concept is of nature, not above nature. In other words, can we design systems that are compatible in nature, that reinforce natural systems rather than undermine them? So one of the design perspectives that we're taking here, and this is something that's happened since the development, since the writing of Bitcoin to BurningMan, this is part of the innovation that's happened in generative design, in synthetic biology, is how do you create resilient systems by generative design. It's a new design principle. And the idea is be able to, how do you design systems that have outcomes that meet resilient metrics, ESG metrics, that actually are resistant to say, pandemics, not just this one, but others that may come down, and then reinforce biodiversity. So the whole premise is that we're developing systems based upon biological principles rather than just simple mechanical principles. So what are the characteristics of resilience? Biological systems are highly resilient. They have a lot of redundancy. They're not designed around efficiency or optimization. They're designed with redundancy. So if something fails, they can reconstruct themselves. The cell is a perfect example. That has a stem cell. It can regenerate any organ. So you have within the cell a blueprint of a whole organism. So you have reserves, you have reconfigurability, you have rapid feedback loops and learning. The immune system is a perfect example. And you have controls that are actions through signaling system, the regulatory networks, genetic regulatory networks, neural networks. They're self-deploying, self-healing, self-organizing. So it's a different principle of organization that we're used to, and particularly from our industrial economy. And you have checks and balances in the sense that systems try to maintain a regulatory harmony or homeostasis through signaling. So one of the great models of resilience is gene regulatory networks. It's been around for almost 3 million years. And I won't go into the details, but it provides a way of designing networks that are scale-free. In other words, the same characteristics perform at different scales. And they've evolved different kind of network roles that make them highly resilient, and robust. And they can be applied to many kind of network design, community network designs. This is the kind of the ideas that we're exploring now to food systems or housing systems, how they regulate themselves, how they interact with themselves. It's very rigorous. And synthetic biology has evolved to the point just where recently, when the COVID virus was discovered in China, they sequenced it very quickly. There were 30,000 nucleotides, and then they made a digital representation of that, and they teleported that digital 30,000 nucleotides, which is 30,000 bits. It was taken around the world, and then it was sequenced again. So the fact that things are living in digital is creating a whole new design perspective that allows us to start to deal with the complexity and the richness of things that we're part of. So the idea of resilience and mutualism too, and this is something that's is probably more appreciated in China than the U.S., but resilience exists in a variety and diversity. The more entropy you have in the system, the more robust it is. And then the concept of governance is to have a distributed governance. It's polycentric. There's no single location, but it distributes itself based upon the particular need, the signaling system. This is the way the brain, the regulatory system that works. And even you have randomization in order to prevent lock-in. In other words, there are certain laws of cybernetics and complexity. One of them is called the law of requisite variety, where you introduce randomness into the system in order to give it robustness. And then the final point is that you have, rather than zero-sum games, you have cooperative game dynamics with trusted signals that yield better and more resilient, higher outcomes.
There's a new world emerging right before our very eyes. A world where we seamlessly and naturally interact with augmented and virtual reality, opening endless possibilities to learn, collaborate, create, and explore. Where spaces and cities become smart, physical and digital goods are tracked, and people's identity, security, and finances are protected, enabling citizens, big data, artificial intelligence, and the Internet of Things to finally work together for the benefit of humanity and the planet. But have you ever stopped and wondered, how do we actually get from here to there? The last few years have shown enormous advances in augmented and virtual reality devices. Computer vision, location tracking, edge computing, blockchain, and 5G. But these applications and the devices and operating systems they utilize are not connected. They're siloed experiences. There's no common standard for how all these technologies and applications can work together. For that, you need a common protocol, a way to communicate between each of these technologies. And for that, you need Verses. Verses has developed the HSTP, or Hyperspace Transfer Protocol, allowing parties to agree on who, what, and where everything is in physical and virtual worlds. This enables anyone with the right permissions to discover what something is, who owns it, where it's located, and what can be done with it. It is a paradigm shift in the future of computing. Verses is currently developing multiple specifications and pilot projects with commercial and enterprise partners, as well as standards groups and governments. Early tests have already demonstrated incredible time and money savings while providing previously inaccessible spatial analytics and spatial performance data. Join us and our many forward-thinking partners and industry leaders as we drive the next generation of innovation and lay down the digital infrastructure to support a better future and a new web for people, businesses, our environment, and humanity. Let's build the spatial web.
This is not necessarily an ad for a particular company. It's a new protocol that's being supported by the IEEE. It's called a spatial protocol, where you have spatial contracts. It's a way of integrating the physical and the digital, and creating ways in which you can have permissions based upon how different kinds of things function in physical and virtual space. It represents to me the next generation of innovation in governance and design. So we're moving into a world where we're going to create virtual digital twins of something, a copy of something, and it's going to have such high fidelity, so accurate, so that we can go from the digital design, into the physical. And we're moving into a world where we're able to model the physical world and the interactions of that and the economies in such a way, with such fidelity, that we can implement them. There are companies that are doing this now in different ways, but not the least of which is Autodesk, which has the world's market on designing, building design. The goal there is to go from a model to actually 3D print a structure. And the approach is what they call generative design. In other words, they design many different combinations, and then they select constraints on them. And genetic algorithms is called fitness functions, and then they identify certain kinds of outcomes that they want to implement. We're starting to develop some of these concepts at the Media Lab in the City Science Group. So part of the idea is also to create currencies for creating resilient local economies. So how do you create the incentives for people to allocate resources that actually achieve these outcomes? So we're developing sort of models, AI models, for how to generate and regulate the issuance of tokens in order to achieve certain kinds of ESG outcomes. So this is a slide that shows a full digital, what I call digital blending and mirroring. It's a representation of a baby. It's done by a gentleman who won Academy Awards for Avatar and other renderings. I think it represents the next generation of thinking. So we'll play this. Okay, thanks.
Yes, that's right. Very good. Yeah. That's right.
Learns naturally. This is what she sees.
他们在训练这个人工智能学习这叫机器学习的一个例子。
Good girl. Good girl.
Learning language.
Yeah, I get that. Okay, let's do that again. Okay.
Mirroring.
他在模仿他。
Yes.
Full model of the brain and ocular system, all neural net, all deep learning models.
所以你在训练这个机器人的时候，它还会模拟给你看，人的大脑会是怎么反应。这真的比较酷，他在玩这个游戏，在学习怎么玩一个。
Yeah, the dopamine system. You can see her now learning a game. She's learning how to play Pong. So that to me is an example where things are going. That you have this very high. It's an autonomous. It's an autonomous avatar that has its own learning, has its own digital brain. It's very sophisticated, and it's very natural looking. So what I'd like to do is end with this comment. It's written by Danny Hillis, who was at the Media Lab. He was an inventor of Connection Machine. He is very active in Disney and Google. He's invented many different things. But I will read it. Maybe you want to read it in Chinese, and then save some time. But it says, "The Enlightenment is dead. Long live the entanglement." Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And appreciate the opportunity to present these ideas. And do we have any time for questions? Let's take some questions.
如果你对 MIT 教授这样的这本书《从比特币到火人节及其他》感兴趣，可以扫屏幕上蓝色二维码购买。购买我们将会赠送50个喵爪币，具体的请扫微信群二维码入群，我们会有相关工作人员进行指导如何获取。最后，如果你想关注更多我们举办的活动，欢迎加入项目社群，与更多对区块链感兴趣的小伙伴们一起讨论。